This is part 5 of America's Two Just Wars, 1775 and 1861, by Rothbard. In the Republican Party, the party of great moral ideas, different men and different factions emphasized different aspects of this integrated, despotic world outlook. In the fateful Republican Convention of 1860, the major candidates for president were two veteran abolitionists, William Seward of New York and Salmon P. Chase of Ohio. Seward, however, was distrusted by the anti-Catholic hotheads because he somehow did not care about the alleged Catholic menace. On the other hand, while Chase was happy to play along with the former know-nothings who stressed the anti-Catholic part of the coalition, he was distrusted by Sewardites and others who were indifferent to the Catholic question. Abraham Lincoln of Illinois was a dark horse who was able to successfully finesse the Catholic question. His major emphasis was on Whig economic statism, high tariffs, huge subsidies to railroads, public works. As one of the nation's leading lawyers for Illinois Central and other big railroads, indeed, Lincoln was virtually the candidate from Illinois Central and other large railroads. One reason for Lincoln's victory at the convention was that Iowa railroad entrepreneur Grenville M. Dodge helped swing the Iowa delegation to Lincoln. In return, early in the Civil War, Lincoln appointed Dodge to Army General. Dodge's task was to clear the Indians from the designated path of the country's first heavily subsidized, federally chartered transcontinental railroad, the Union Pacific. In this way, conscripted Union troops and hapless taxpayers were coerced into socializing the costs on constructing and operating the Union Pacific. This sort of action is now called, euphemistically, the cooperation of government and industry. But Lincoln's major focus was on raising taxes, in particular, raising and enforcing the tariff. His convention victory was particularly made possible by support from the Pennsylvania delegation. Pennsylvania had long been the home and the political focus of the nation's iron and steel industry, which, ever since its inception during the War of 1812, had been chronically inefficient, and had therefore constantly been bawling for high tariffs and later import quotas. Virtually the first act of the Lincoln administration was to pass the Morrill Protective Tariff Act, doubling existing tariff rates and creating the highest tariff rates in American history. In his first inaugural, Lincoln was conciliatory about maintaining slavery. What he was hardline about toward the South was insistence on collecting all the customs tariffs in that region. As Lincoln put it, the federal government would collect the duties and imposts, but beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against people anywhere. The significance of the federal forts is that they provided the soldiers to enforce the customs tariffs. Thus, Fort Sumter was at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, the major port, apart from New Orleans, in the entire South. The federal troops at Sumter were needed to enforce the tariffs that were supposed to be levied at Charleston Harbor. Of course, Abraham Lincoln's conciliatory words on slavery cannot be taken at face value. Lincoln was a master politician, which means that he was a consummate conniver, manipulator, and liar. The federal forts were the key to his successful prosecution of the war. Lying to South Carolina Abraham Lincoln managed to do what Franklin D. Roosevelt and Henry Stimson did at Pearl Harbor 80 years later: maneuvered the Southerners into firing the first shot. In this way, by manipulating the South into firing first against a federal fort, Lincoln made the South appear to be aggressors in the eyes of numerous waverers and moderates in the North. Outside of New England and territories populated by transplanted New Englanders, the idea of forcing the South to stay in the Union was highly unpopular. In many middle-tier states, including Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, there was a considerable sentiment to mimic the South by forming a middle confederacy to isolate the pesky and fanatical Yankees. Even after the war began, the mayor of New York City and many other dignitaries of the city proposed that the city secede from the Union and make peace and engage in free trade with the South. Indeed, Jefferson Davis's lawyer after the war was what we would now call the Paleo-Libertarian, leader of the New York City Bar, Irish Catholic Charles O'Connor, who ran for president in 1878 on the straight Democrat ticket, in protest that his beloved Democratic Party's nominee for president was the abolitionist, protectionist, socialist, and fool Horace Greeley. The Lincoln administration and the Republican Party took advantage of the overwhelmingly Republican Congress after the secession of the South to push through almost the entire Whig economic program. Lincoln signed no less than 10 tariff-raising bills during his administration. Heavy sin taxes were levied on alcohol and tobacco. The income tax was levied for the first time in American history. Huge land grants and monetary subsidies were handed out to transcontinental railroads, accompanied by a vast amount of attendant corruption. And the government went off the gold standard and virtually nationalized the banking system to establish a machine for printing new money and to provide cheap credit for the business elite. And furthermore, the new model army and the war effort rested on a vast and unprecedented amount of federal coercion against Northerners as well as the South. A huge army was conscripted. Dissenters and advocates of a negotiated peace with the South were jailed, and the precious Anglo-Saxon right of habeas corpus was abolished for the duration. While it is true that Lincoln himself was not particularly religious, that did not really matter, because he adopted all the attitudes and temperament of his evangelical allies. He was stern and sober. He was personally opposed to alcohol and tobacco, and he was opposed to the private carrying of guns. An ambitious seeker of the main chance from early adulthood, Lincoln acted viciously toward his own humble frontier family in Kentucky. He abandoned his fiancée in order to marry a wealthier Mary Todd, whose family were friends of the eminent Henry Clay. He repudiated his brother, and he refused to attend his dying father or his father's funeral, monstrously declaring that such an experience would be more painful than pleasant. No doubt. Lincoln, too, was a typical example of a humanitarian with a guillotine in another dimension, a familiar, modern, reformed liberal type whose heart bleeds for and yearns to uplift remote mankind, while he lies to and treats abominably actual people whom he knew. And so Abraham Lincoln, in a phrase prefiguring our own beloved Mario Cuomo, declared that the Union was really a family bound indissolubly together by the most intimate organic bonds. Kick your own family, and then transmute familial spiritual feelings toward a hypostatized and mythical entity, the union, which must then be kept intact regardless of concrete human cost or sacrifice. Indeed, there is a vital critical difference between the two unjust causes we have described, the British and the North. The British, at least, were fighting on behalf of a cause which, even if wrong and unjust, was coherent and intelligible, that is, the sovereignty of a hereditary monarch. What was the North's excuse for their monstrous war of plunder and mass murder against their fellow Americans? Not allegiance to an actual, real person, the king, but allegiance to a non-existent, mystical, quasi-divine, alleged entity, the Union. The king was at least a real person, and the merits or demerits of a particular king or the monarchy in general can be argued. But where is the Union located? How are we to gauge the Union's deeds? To whom is this Union accountable? The Union was taken by its northern worshippers from a contractual institution that can either be cleaved to or scrapped, and turned into a divinized entity, which must be worshipped, and which must be permanent, unquestioned, all-powerful. There is no heresy greater, nor political theory more pernicious, than sacralizing the secular. But this monstrous process is precisely what happened when Abraham Lincoln and his northern colleagues made a god out of the Union. If the British forces fought for bad King George, the Union armies pillaged and murdered on behalf of this pagan idol, this Union, this Moloch, that demanded terrible human sacrifice to sustain its power and its glory. For in this war between the states, the South may have fought for its sacred honor, but the Northern war was the very opposite of honorable. We remember the care with which the civilized nations had developed classical international law. Above all, civilians must not be targeted. Wars must be limited. But the North insisted on creating a conscript army, a nation in arms, and broke the 19th century rules of war by specifically plundering and slaughtering civilians, by destroying civilian life and institutions so as to reduce the South to submission. Sherman's infamous march through Georgia was one of the great war crimes and crimes against humanity of the past century and a half, because by targeting and butchering civilians, Lincoln and Grant and Sherman paved the way for all the genocidal horrors of the monstrous 20th century. There has been a lot of talk in recent years about memory, about never forgetting about history as retroactive punishment for crimes of war and mass murder. As Lord Acton, the great libertarian historian, put it, the historian, in the last analysis, must be a moral judge. The muse of the historian, he wrote, is not Clio, but Rhadamanthus, the legendary avenger of innocent blood. In that spirit, we must always remember, we must never forget, we must put in the dock and hang higher than Haman those who, in modern times, opened the Pandora's box of genocide and the extermination of civilians. Sherman, Grant, and Lincoln. Perhaps someday their statues, like Lenin's in Russia, will be toppled and melted down. Their insignias and battle flags will be desecrated, their war songs tossed into the fire. And then Davis and Lee and Jackson and Forrest and all the heroes of the South, Dixie and the Stars and Bars, will once again be truly honored and remembered. The classic comment on that meretricious TV series, The Civil War, was made by that marvelous and feisty Southern writer, Florence King. Asked her views on the series, she replied, "I didn't have time to watch The Civil War. I'm too busy getting ready for the next one." In that spirit, I am sure that one day, aided and abetted by Northerners like myself in the glorious Copperhead tradition, the South shall rise again.